And of course, earlier we heard from the UN's Antonio Guterres, who said that agency was pleading not just billions of dollars worth in aid support, but also calling for the war to come to an end, saying it is not the answer, but in fact a distraction from some of the multiple challenges that face the global community. Well, human rights groups have raised alarm over what they describe as increasing censorship campaigns following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's claimed Moscow has threatened independent media outlets that are reporting on that war. Well, let's find out exactly what has been happening there. We're joined by Human Rights Watch Europe and Central Asia Director Hugh Williamson. Hugh, good evening to you. Thanks for your time tonight on News at Prime. So you're speaking directly here about reports of human rights violations that have taken place. Give us a sense of what you have received officially.
If we're focused on Ukraine itself, then, I mean, the Ukrainian government has announced that at least 325 civilians have been killed so far. That's a data from yesterday evening. And there's also reports that dozens have been killed in Kharkiv today. That's the second biggest city in a Russian attack on a residential area. In addition, we reported over the weekend that there was evidence that Russia has used cluster munitions, which is a banned form of weaponry because it's too indiscriminate. And that was an attack on a primary school or an education center in eastern Ukraine, and that killed 4 people. So there's significant evidence of Russia violating what is called the laws of war, which are the laws which govern these sorts of military conflicts in which civilians should be protected. So we're in the 5th day of this conflict, and it's looking very serious.
When we take a look at part of what has unfolded in Ukraine as well, particularly what is happening with regards to the attacks on communication channels, whether we're talking social media, whether we're talking the internet itself, how have you found that that has perhaps affected at least the right to freedom of speech and the ability for people, particularly in the media, to also do their work?
If we're talking about Ukraine, then obviously there's, it's very difficult. The communications are tough in that country at the moment. There's been cyber attacks by Russia on institutions in Ukraine. We call on the Russian authorities to stop doing that. And we're urging Ukraine to allow, obviously, a free media to work and for journalists to be able to do their work. In Russia itself, we're very concerned about limits on social media and on independent media. We reported at the weekend that there's strict limits on Facebook and on Twitter because of their efforts to share free information in the country. And even more seriously, the main media regulator in Russia has warned 10 independent media that they will be blocked or they will be fined if they simply report the facts of what's been happening in Ukraine, if they use the word invasion, or if they use the phrase declaration of war, or they report on the number of Russian soldiers who've been killed. Simple facts like that, and they could be blocked from doing their ordinary journalistic work. And that's an extreme form of censorship, even for Russia, which Russia should hold back from doing and allow the media to do their work.
And when you then analyze these restrictions, what do you believe is behind it? So why do you think Russia does not want media outlets that are reporting within that country and to the rest of the world what is happening, at least factually, in Ukraine and in that country?
One can only speculate that they want to limit the access of their population to what's happening in Ukraine. There's a military conflict going on. As we know, President Putin has denied that it's even an invasion. He calls it a military exercise or a military operation. And they want to limit access of the population, perhaps because they feel the population may be even more angry or upset about what's happening in Ukraine, a neighboring country. So whatever the motivation is from a human rights point of view, this is a violation of Russia's international commitments to human rights. This is a difficult time to talk about those commitments, but nevertheless they are very important because they underpin the way a country like Russia should act at this time. So, whatever the motivation, Russia should not be censoring in such a blanket way.
Hugh, I was talking earlier about the statement that we saw given by the UN's Antonio Guterres just a short while ago. And there's been a lot of talk about the need for global solidarity, particularly when it comes to supporting the people of Ukraine in this moment. For organizations like yourself, what does that look like?
I mean, for us at the moment, we're, as a human rights organization, our role at this time is to encourage both sides to protect civilians. So for us, that sort of solidarity is a solidarity, which looks like the Ukrainian authorities and the Russian authorities prioritize not targeting civilians in any way, not targeting institutions such as schools and hospitals in the conflict. That's one side. The second side is what's happening at Ukraine's borders. As we know, hundreds of thousands of people have been attempting to flee Ukraine because of the fighting, and many of them have gone towards European Union countries, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Romania. And solidarity there looks like opening the borders, making it easy, straightforward, unbureaucratic for those people to move into those countries, enabling them to stay for longer periods of time without having to apply for asylum. Those are decisions the European Union has made, and we welcome that. But those should be reinforced. There should be humanitarian help for people leaving the country. And indeed, the Ukrainian authorities should not stand in the way of people who want to leave. We have reports that there are long queues taking hours and hours on the Ukrainian side of the border. So we understand why it's necessary for the Ukrainian authorities to check who is leaving, but it's important they do not stand in the way of people who are fleeing for their lives.
One of the other reports that we have seen about what's happening at the border, as you're mentioning there, is that not only are people being prevented in some instances from going across, but there also seems to be a lot of racial profiling that is taking place there. What do you know about that?
Yeah, we're very concerned of those reports that non-Ukrainian people, often people from Africa, indeed, from African countries, or from Asia being stopped. We have not fully confirmed what's happening, but we have obviously heard the reports that Nigerians, people from Kenya, other countries have found it very difficult to leave. We're trying to establish that. We understand it's mostly on the Ukrainian side of the border that it's difficult for people to get through, rather than on the Polish or the Hungarian or Romanian side of the border. We call on Ukraine, as I said, to enable people to not stand in the way of everybody who wants to leave, not just Ukrainians. We also call on the European countries to open their borders to everybody, not just Ukrainians, but to all of the also non-Ukrainians who want to leave. There are 500,000 people in Ukraine who are not Ukrainians, and we call on Europe to enable those people to enter the European territories.
Of course, it is important, Hugh, that an organization like Human Rights Watch is vocal on these issues and is really seen as taking the lead. I wonder, though, what work is happening behind the scenes in as far as actual lobbying of what is taking place in these countries to result in that change and ensure that you will actually be heard.
It's a good question, and obviously we're also working with human rights organizations in Russia and in Ukraine on this. We're not alone. We have close partners in both countries. Of course, we're trying to find channels, to communicate our messages. Doing that in Russia has always been more difficult for a human rights group like us because they resist the dialogue with Human Rights Watch or other groups. In Ukraine, it's been more straightforward before the conflict. Obviously, now the government has many, many challenges. But obviously, we are also trying to find channels where we can communicate our messages to the Ukrainian authorities. So rest assured, we're doing our best not only to talk in public about it, but also to lobby the authorities very directly with the human rights findings we are making.
Europe and Central Asia Director at Human Rights Watch, Hugh Williamson. Thank you for your time tonight, Hugh.